Welcome. Today, we're jumping into a really powerful idea about why we so often chase happiness, but just end up feeling, well, unfulfilled. It all boils down to a new way of looking at our inner world, a kind of user's guide to finding genuine harmony.
So let's kick things off with a feeling I bet a lot of us know all too well. You work super hard, you finally get the thing you wanted, the new job, the dream car, and for a second, it feels amazing. But then, once that initial buzz wears off, that little voice creeps back in, asking, is this it? So what's going on there? Well, the framework we're digging into today says this feeling comes from being stuck in something called a deprivation loop. I know this diagram looks a little intense, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. You feel like something's missing, so you try to fill that gap with more stuff. But instead of feeling satisfied, you just end up feeling like you still don't have enough, which puts you right back on that hamster wheel of wanting more.
So what's the real root of this endless loop? The whole thing, according to this idea, stems from one huge mistake in how we see ourselves. We have this gross misunderstanding that a person is only the physical body. And because of that, we try to solve all of our problems, even the deep emotional ones, with physical things.
All right, so if we're not just the body, then what are we? This framework suggests a human being is actually a coexistence of two very different but connected parts. Let's break down what that means. So here it is, the core idea. A human being is made up of the self, that's your consciousness, the I that's thinking and feeling right now, and the body, which is the material part. The absolute key here is that because these two things are so different, they have completely different sets of needs.
Let's start with the basics. The self, the I, what it's really looking for is happiness. And that's not a physical object. It's feelings, like respect, trust, affection. The body, on the other hand, it needs physical stuff to keep going. Food, clothing, a place to live. Pretty straightforward, right?
But here's where it gets really interesting. The nature of these needs is totally different. The self's need for happiness is continuous. It's not like you only want respect on a Tuesday, right? You want it all the time. And it's qualitative. You can't measure trust by the pound. The body's needs, totally opposite. They're temporary and quantitative. You need food, but only for a little while, and you can measure exactly how much.
Now this chart, this really gets into the nitty-gritty, comparing the self and the body on all these different levels. For instance, just look at the row for fulfilled by. For the body, it's simple, physiochemical things, food and water. But for the self, it's right understanding and right feeling. Or check out in time. The body's activities like eating are temporary, but the self's activities like thinking are going on all the time. This just drives home the point that they are running on two totally different operating systems.
Okay, so if the self's main goal is continuous happiness, and we now know physical stuff can't give us that, then how in the world do we get it? Well, this framework says the answer is all about organizing our inner world.
I mean, think about it for a second. Your mind is never really truly quiet, is it? There's this constant stream of desires, thoughts, and expectations just running in the background 24/7. In this framework, that whole process gets a name: imagination. It's like the engine of yourself, always running, always processing.
So, where does this engine get its instructions from? It seems to come from three main places. First, there's preconditioning. That's all the stuff we've been taught by our family, by society. Then there's sensation, just the raw data coming in from our five senses. And finally, there's natural acceptance. And you can think of this as your conscience, your gut feeling, that deep inner voice that just knows what's right, way beyond what you've been told or what just feels good for a second.
And wow, this slide just lays it all out perfectly. On the left, you've got this picture of inner chaos. See how the scales are all out of whack? That's what happens when our thoughts and desires are just being yanked around by outside influences and what our senses are telling us. But on the right, that's harmony. The scales are balanced. Why? Because the imagination is being guided by that inner voice, by natural acceptance, and everything just lines up.
And that brings us to the main event. Real, lasting happiness isn't something you go out and get. It's a state you create on the inside. It's what happens when your moment-to-moment thoughts and desires are perfectly in sync with your deepest, truest sense of what's right.
Okay, so we've looked at what harmony inside the self looks like. But what about its relationship with the body? I mean, if they're two different things, how are they supposed to get along?
The big idea here is something called self-regulation. And hey, this isn't about restriction or being super strict. It's a feeling of responsibility. It's that moment when the self really gets that the body is its tool, its instrument, and it consciously steps up to take care of it, to nurture it, protect it, and use it in the right way. And that feeling of responsibility isn't just some fuzzy concept. It actually translates into a real practical program for health. It means paying attention to what your body takes in, getting into a good routine, making sure it gets movement, and using medicine only when you actually need it. The self becomes the dedicated caretaker for the body.
You know, once you really start to see yourself this way, as this coexistence of self and body, it can completely flip the script on how you look at big life goals, especially the whole idea of success and prosperity.
We usually think of prosperity as having, a ton of money. But in this view, real prosperity is actually a feeling, not a bank account balance. It starts when you correctly figure out what your body's physical needs are, and here's the kicker, they're limited. And then you realize you actually have more than enough to meet them. That's what breaks that deprivation loop we talked about, and replaces that awful feeling of not enough with the genuine feeling of abundance.
This final diagram really pulls everything we've talked about together. You can see the conscious self over here on the left, whose needs are continuous, taking responsibility for the material body on the right, whose needs are temporary. And that relationship is managed right here in the middle through self-regulation. The result? As these arrows show, you get a healthy body and a happy, harmonious self. It's basically the blueprint for the whole system.
So when it all comes down to it, the question this leaves us with is a really big one to think about. In your everyday life, in the goals you set, what are you really feeding? Are you just throwing physical, temporary things at the deep, continuous needs of yourself? Or are you learning how to actually nurture both parts of your being, giving each one what it truly needs to thrive?